The heart monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm as Katie Morrison logged into the cardiac unit system at Sacred Heart, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of muscle memory that came from 17 years of encrypted military databases. Her nursing scrubs were navy blue, crisp, identical to everyone else's on the 7th floor of Sacred Heart in Norfolk. Nobody here knew that beneath the collar sat a woman who'd once carried 13 men out of Sangin's killing fields with nothing but morphine, tourniquets, and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst the world could throw at you. The password screen dissolved into patient charts. Names. Vitals. Billing codes that made her jaw clench. Her eyes moved across the monitor. 0247 hours. Middle of the night shift, which was why she preferred it. Fewer people. Less noise. Less time spent pretending to be smaller than she was. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular hum that never quite went away, the sound you learn to sleep through in field hospitals where the generator ran 24/7 and nobody got to sleep anyway. She pulled up the cardiac unit patient roster and began her documentation rounds, checking each file for accuracy, for the small discrepancies that most nurses overlooked but that Katie Morrison never did. That was the problem. That was always the problem. The Department of Defense had erased her existence from Pentagon servers 6 years ago. Not dishonorable. Not a pension loss. Just gone. Classified. After she'd testified in a war crimes case, after she'd put names and dates and operational details into an official record, someone high enough up the chain had decided that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison represented a security liability. No phone calls. No explanation. Just a conversation with a JAG officer in a room with no windows, and then her clearance vanished. Her direct deposit continued. Her medical coverage remained active. But her service record became classified, filed in some basement vault at Fort Meade, accessible only to people with the kind of security clearance that came with a helicopter and a badge that opened doors in the Pentagon. So she disappeared into the civilian world. Nursing had been natural. She'd already spent a decade keeping soldiers alive in conditions that would break most people. A hospital was just a cleaner version of the same work. Same protocols. Same triage mentality. Same acceptance that you couldn't save everyone but you could still try. Katie Morrison had gotten good at the trying part. She just had to learn how to do it without anyone knowing that she'd already done it before, that every wound care procedure and every cardiac monitor interpretation and every full line she placed had been preceded by 100 similar moments in combat conditions where a mistake meant somebody didn't come home. She logged into the patient management system and typed in her credentials. The screen flickered. Loaded. And there it was. Room 712. Colonel Marcus Vance. Age 52. Traumatic brain injury sustained in a classified operation. Status, stable but unconscious. Prognosis, guarded. The medical history was sparse, redacted in places that made Katie's throat go tight. She knew those redactions. She knew what they meant. She'd been written out of documents that looked exactly like this one. Katie stood from her desk and walked toward the ICU wing. The hallway was quiet. Just the whisper of ventilation systems pushing filtered air through ducts, the distant hum of refrigeration units, the soft padding of her shoes on linoleum that had been cleaned 6 hours ago. She passed the medication dispensary where the lights cast everything in surgical blue, reached room 712, and pushed the door open with her fingertips. The colonel lay in the bed like a man carved from stone. Ventilator tube taped to his face. 3 lines running to his arm. Monitoring electrodes forming a grid across his chest. His left arm was positioned at his side, and on the underside of his bicep, a faded tattoo caught the pale light from the bedside monitor. One word. Morrison. Just that. The ink had been there for years, maybe decades, the edges blurred by time and sun exposure. Katie stopped moving. Her hands were steady. Her breath was measured. The trembling that some people might have felt, she'd learned to bury that kind of thing 17 years ago, back when she was still learning how to carry things that were too heavy to put down. She adjusted his blanket, tucking it under the mattress with clinical precision. Her fingers brushed the tattoo without touching it. Standard patient care. Professional distance. The kind of composure that meant she could stand in a room with her own name written on a man's body and move through it like she was reading a chart. The colonel's monitors continued their electronic conversation, beep, 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 the steady rhythm of a heart that was still trying. Katie checked his 4 lines. All patent. Fluids running at the correct rate. She made a note on his chart. Everything in order. Everything normal. Everything a lie. She pulled his personal effects from the bedside cabinet. Hospital policy. Items belonged in a secure locker, not in a room where they could get lost. There was a wallet. A watch with a leather band. And inside his jacket, folded carefully, something that made her stop breathing for exactly 1 second. A faded unit patch. The insignia of her own unit. Not the unit markers Vance had served with. Her unit. The letters were stitched in faded gold thread, and below them, in a tighter font, the names of the soldiers who'd operated under that patch. She found hers immediately. SEPOK Morrison. Top of the list. Carried 13 men out of Sangin. That was the unspoken part, the part that wasn't written because it wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Katie folded the patch back into the jacket and placed both items in the secure locker. Her hands were steady as she closed the metal door. Her breathing was normal. Her heart rate had spiked exactly twice, once when she saw the tattoo, once when she saw her own name. She was going to need to meditate later, or go for a run, or do some of the other things that people did to process information they weren't supposed to have received. For now, she just documented everything in the chart, clinical notes in her precise handwriting, and returned to the nurse's station. The cardiac unit at midnight was a different hospital than the cardiac unit at noon. Fewer staff. More time to notice things. More time to look at billing codes and wonder why the cardiac catheterization lab had charged for 73 diagnostic angiograms in the past 2 months when the schedule log showed only 34 procedures had been performed. More time to read the follow-up notes and find phantom procedures, interventions that appeared in the billing system but not in the patient charts, not in the procedure logs, not anywhere except in the column that mattered most to certain people. The column that moved money from insurance companies to hospital accounts to private accounts that existed in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Katie had been documenting this for 6 weeks. Not trying to be a hero. Not trying to be anything. Just being a meticulous nurse who checked details because that's what meticulous nurses did. Back in Sangin, she'd checked supply manifests. Back in field hospitals, she'd checked medication logs. It was work. It was documentation. It was how people stayed alive. Here, she was just doing the same thing in a different uniform. She wasn't trying to catch anyone. She was just trying to understand the system she was part of. That was when Dr. Sterling had started noticing her. She first became aware of him when he appeared at her desk around 0400 hours, a designer coffee in his hand, a Rolex watch catching the fluorescent light on his wrist. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a kind of expensive grooming that money alone couldn't buy, good genetics helping. His hair was silver and styled. His suit probably cost more than Katie's monthly rent. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. He just set his coffee down on the edge of her desk and looked at the screens where her documentation work was displayed. Working late, new nurse. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, deep, controlled, lethally casual. Dr. Sterling. The name was on his hospital ID badge, clipped to his lapel. Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. 15 years at Sacred Heart. Published in medical journals. Respected. Feared. The kind of doctor who operated on executives and politicians and people who had the kind of money that made problems disappear. Middle shift rotation, Katie said. Her voice was still small. Still deferential. Still the careful tone of someone who knew how to make herself less threatening. Just finishing my documentation. He smiled. Not a warm smile. A smile like a shark showing its teeth before it decided whether you were worth eating. Thorough. I like that. Keep it up. He left. But Katie had already noticed the way his eyes had lingered on her screen. Not at her. At the cardiac unit patient roster. At the billing codes. At the exact work she'd been doing for 6 weeks in the quiet hours when nobody was watching. She'd been a senior chief petty officer long enough to recognize threat assessment when someone was doing it. Dr. Sterling had just assessed her as a threat, and now he was calibrating his response. 3 days later, Sterling made his move. The cafeteria at lunch. 200 people present. Security cameras covering every angle. Katie stood in the serving line with her tray, salad, grilled chicken, water, when Sterling appeared beside her. He was with another doctor, someone from orthopedics, someone with a laugh that carried too loud through the space. He was loud. He wanted an audience. That was the whole point. "Gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "I've got a new bet for you. The night shift nurse. The thorough one. She'll quit within a week. I'm putting down $500. Katie kept moving through the line. Her jaw was tight. Not trembling. Tight. Like a muscle held under tension, which was all that composure really was, tension held in the right places. "What makes you think she'll quit?" someone asked. "Because I'm going to make her life impossible," Sterling said. "And she doesn't have the spine for it." Katie reached the end of the serving line. She was 3 steps away from a table where she could have sat down, where she could have eaten her lunch, where she could have been small and quiet and invisible. That was when Sterling reached out and knocked her tray from her hands. The plastic plate hit the linoleum and shattered. The chicken scattered. The salad spread across the floor like a crime scene. 300 eyes turned toward her. Katie stood still. Her hands were empty. Her tray was gone. The food was gone. Sterling was standing 2 feet away, his smile wider now, waiting for her to do what everyone expected her to do. Cry. Apologize. Run to a bathroom. Pick up the pieces and prove that she was exactly what he thought she was, someone who could be broken by a humiliation. She didn't do any of those things. Instead, she looked at Dr. Sterling. She let her eyes move across his face, assessing him the way she'd assessed hundreds of things in combat zones: distance, threat level, probability of escalation. Then she spoke. Her voice was different now. Lower. Not small anymore. The kind of voice that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor." The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electronic buzz. Sterling's smile faltered. He wasn't used to being answered. He was used to being feared, respected, obeyed. But what Katie Morrison had just given him was something else entirely. She'd given him calm. Absolute, steady calm. The kind that came from a place where ego didn't matter because bigger things were already at stake. She walked away from the spilled lunch. She walked past Sterling without breaking eye contact. She walked toward the exit, left the cafeteria, and went back upstairs where Colonel Marcus Vance lay unconscious with her name written on his arm, where the cardiac unit charts held billing codes that didn't add up, where the real work was still waiting to be done. Behind her, the cafeteria stayed silent. Nobody ate. Nobody moved. Sterling stood alone in the middle of the floor, holding the memory of her eyes, understanding with sudden clarity that he'd made a serious miscalculation about who exactly he was threatening. Morning rounds on day 3 started like all the others, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the acrid smell of antiseptic mixing with stale coffee from the break room. Katie pushed the med cart down the 7th floor corridor of Sacred Heart's cardiac unit, her documentation meticulous as always. Chart notes organized by timestamp. Medication reconciliation flagged for discrepancies. Billing codes cross-referenced against actual procedures performed. She'd been trained to notice when things didn't add up, and Dr. Sterling's cardiac unit had more inconsistencies than a 3-star general's expense report. She didn't know he was watching her yet. Sterling emerged from room 712 like a storm front moving inland, his white coat flapping, his voice already rising before he reached her. "Nurse Morrison." Not a greeting. A summons. The entire unit shifted. 2 residents paused mid-conversation. A phlebotomist pretended to check a lab slip. Sterling positioned himself between Katie and the medication cart, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. Perhaps if you spent less time second-guessing physician orders and more time learning your place, we'd run more efficiently around here. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in compounds with shrapnel overhead, when panic was a luxury and composure was survival. She held his gaze without flinching, her hand steady at her sides. She said nothing. The silence stretched across 3 seconds, 4, 5, long enough for someone down the hall to cough, for a heart monitor to beep its steady rhythm in the distance, for Sterling's jaw to clench slightly at her refusal to apologize or defend herself. He turned and walked away. That was his mistake number 2. The first had been the cafeteria. This would be the third. Day 5 arrived with Katie working a double shift, pulling 12 hours to pick up extra cases Sterling kept assigning her, the most complex patients, the ones requiring constant reassessment, the ones designed to exhaust her. She sat alone in the cafeteria at 1,400 hours, a modest lunch on her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water. She'd learned long ago not to waste energy on food when focus was the scarce resource. Sterling approached from behind her left side, which meant she heard him before she fully saw him, a tactical disadvantage he clearly intended. He lifted her tray with one smooth motion. The coffee spilled first, a brown wave that soaked across her scrubs, staining them the color of old blood. The sandwich followed, plate clattering against the tile floor with a sound like ammunition hitting concrete. The apple rolled across the cafeteria in a slow arc, coming to rest against a table leg. The room went exactly as silent as a trauma bay when the patient flatlines, that particular absence of sound that means everyone has stopped breathing. "I'm taking bets," Sterling announced to the crowd of 50 staff members now staring at them both. His voice carried the tone of a man who believed himself untouchable, which was dangerous. "This one quits within a week. Anyone want in?" Laughter rippled through the cafeteria like a contagion, the kind of nervous laughter that happens when someone's being destroyed and the crowd isn't sure if they're allowed to witness it or if they're supposed to pretend nothing happened. Katie stood slowly, grabbed napkins from a dispenser, knelt without hesitation and began gathering the broken pieces, careful, methodical, the way someone picks up shell casings after a firefight. One tear escaped her right eye as she knelt there. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her jaw set like a drawer sliding shut. Then she stood, threw the napkins and broken plate into the trash, and walked back to the unit. Nobody called after her. Nobody offered to help. That was also part of Sterling's plan: isolate her, make her invisible, ensure she had no allies when the real pressure came. The next morning, day 6, Katie reviewed patient charts in the hallway near room 714. Colonel Marcus Vance lay unconscious 2 floors above her, his left arm bearing a tattoo she recognized with a precision that burned, the name Morrison, faded but unmistakable, etched in ink by someone who'd owed her a debt they couldn't pay with words. She'd never spoken to him about it. Couldn't. The record said she'd never met him at all. Sterling appeared carrying Colonel Vance's chart, his movements too casual, too choreographed. He let the chart drop from his hands and watched it scatter across the tile floor, individual pages fanning out like playing cards from a rigged deck. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Or is bending over beneath your dignity?" His smile was the smile of someone who'd never faced consequences, who'd never learned that arrogance was a weapon that could be turned around if you waited long enough. Katie knelt again, gathering each page with deliberate care. She noted the billing codes as she collected them: phantom cardiac catheterizations, duplicated electrophysiology studies, diagnostic procedures listed twice in a single patient encounter. Sterling wasn't just corrupt. He was bold about it, which meant he believed himself truly untouchable. She stood and met his eyes. Her voice came out the way it sounded when she'd given orders to combat medics under fire, each word placed with the precision of a surgical blade. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor." His smile froze. The muscles around his mouth tightened like someone had applied a tourniquet to his confidence. He'd expected anger, tears, submission, the reactions that would confirm his assessment of her as someone beneath him. Instead, he'd received calm observation, the kind of response that came from someone who'd already survived worse than his contempt. He turned and walked away, but something had shifted in his spine, a rigidity that suggested he was recalibrating his approach. That night, Sterling sat in his office with the door closed and Colonel Vance's employment application spread across his desk. He'd kept copies of every staff member's hiring paperwork as a matter of habit, the kind of habit that came naturally to predators who understood that information was leverage. Katie's application was sparse. References were minimal, only 3, all hospital-adjacent, all vague about the dates and nature of her employment. There were gaps in her work history, whole years unaccounted for. A normal applicant would have explained them. Katie hadn't. That silence meant she was hiding something, and Sterling understood that hidden things could be weaponized. He reached for his desk phone at 2,130 hours. The call went to a board member he'd golfed with for 3 years, a man named Patterson who controlled hospital hiring and retention. "I need you to look into someone's background," Sterling said, his voice the smooth tone of someone asking a favor between friends. "One of the nurses on my unit. Something doesn't add up." He gave Katie's full name, her hire date, the vague statement that her references seemed inconsistent with her timeline. "I'm just flagging it." "Probably nothing. But we should verify credentials, right? Especially in cardiac care. Can't be too careful." Patterson agreed to look into it. That was all Sterling needed. The machinery of institutional power would do the rest, the background checks, the credential verification, the quiet questions in the right ears. What that machinery didn't know was that it was about to collide with something far more formidable than a hospital administrator's suspicions. The shift changed at 2,300 hours. Katie settled into evening rounds, checking cardiac monitors, reviewing vital signs, ensuring her documentation was precise enough to withstand any scrutiny. She moved through the unit with a quietness that made her nearly invisible to the staff who'd witnessed Sterling's campaign against her, that particular invisibility that comes when people decide you're either beneath them or too dangerous to acknowledge. She didn't notice the way colleagues stopped conversations when she entered rooms. She didn't register that Sterling had assigned her to the most unstable patients and the ones with the most complex billing scenarios, patients whose cases would require her to spend hours documenting and hours questioning themselves. She only knew her job. And her job was about to demand something that no amount of institutional power could prevent. At 0300 hours exactly, the alarm on Colonel Vance's monitor screamed through the 7th floor like a siren announcing the end of the world. The monitor screamed at 0300 hours. 3 short bursts, then a continuous wail that cut through the 7th floor like a trauma alert. Katie's eyes snapped open in the break room. She'd been sitting in the dark, staring at nothing, her coffee cold for 2 hours. She moved before her brain caught up to her body. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Down the corridor. The sound grew louder. Vance's room. The numbers on his cardiac display told the story in a language she'd learned in blood and dust. His heart rate was 142. His blood pressure had collapsed to 68/44. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the fact that the man beneath it was dying in real time. But it wasn't his heart that was failing. It was something darker, something quieter. The jugular veins in his neck were distended like ropes, swollen and straining. His skin had turned the color of old concrete. Katie didn't call a code. She didn't hit the emergency button. She placed one hand on his arm and read his body the way she'd read casualties in Sangin, quick assessment, no panic, muscle memory that transcended panic. Cardiac tamponade. Blood was compressing his heart inside the pericardium, the sac that held it. Every beat was fighting against pressure that shouldn't exist. His body was drowning in its own blood. Katie had seen this once before, in a compound outside Sangin Valley where a medic, a young kid from Tennessee, had performed a field pericardiocentesis with nothing but a needle and nerve steady as a rifle shot. The patient had lived. The medic had made it home. Katie had written both of their names in her private journal, the one she kept locked in a safe deposit box under a name that wasn't hers. She moved to the supply cart. Gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. Betadine swab. She wasn't thinking about authorization or protocols or the fact that Dr. Sterling had spent the last 72 hours documenting every breath she took. Pain is data. Fear is information. And Vance's body was screaming in a voice only she could hear. The intercostal space. Between the fifth and sixth rib. She found it with her fingers, the groove, the landmark, the anatomical roadmap she'd learned when she was 23 years old and the sky above Sangin burned orange from muzzle flash. She marked the spot with her thumbnail, a small pressure that left a white crescent on his skin. The angle was critical. Not perpendicular. Angled toward the left shoulder, beneath the xiphoid process, advancing the needle in a slow constant movement toward the pericardium itself. 45 degrees. Her hands were steady. No tremor. No hesitation. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her, indifferent witnesses to what was happening in the dark. The needle advanced. She felt the resistance change as she penetrated the skin, then the muscle, then the chest wall itself. The pericardium was taut. She could feel it resisting before she felt it give. The needle broke through. She advanced the syringe plunger and watched as dark blood filled the chamber, not the bright red of arterial flow, but the thick maroon of pooled blood that had nowhere to go. 120 cubic centimeters. The pressure released like air hissing from a tire. She aspirated slowly, methodically, the same way she'd been trained in a gymnasium at Dam Neck Naval Station where instructors with call signs like Breaker and Gator had taught her that calm hands save lives. On the monitor, Vance's blood pressure rose. 68 to 75. 75 to 80. 80 to 90. 90 to 110. The numbers climbed like a pilot ascending through cloud cover. Color flooded back into his face. His oxygen saturation, which had been dropping toward the low 80s, stabilized at 96%. She withdrew the needle with the same controlled precision with which she'd inserted it, applied pressure to the site with sterile gauze, and waited for the bleeding to stop. 3 minutes. Then she taped the dressing down and stood back. The room was still. Vance was still breathing. His heart was still beating. His body had been pulled back from the edge of the cliff and was gasping for oxygen like a man pulled from drowning water. Katie documented everything in the patient chart using military time stamps. 0307 hours, vitals crashing. 0309 hours, field pericardiocentesis performed. 0310 hours, aspirated 120 cubic centimeters blood from pericardial space. 0312 hours, vitals stabilized. She wrote it all down because documentation was armor. Documentation was proof. Documentation was the only weapon she had that didn't require authorization. What she didn't know was that Dr. Sterling had been watching the monitor from the nursing station. What she didn't know was that he'd seen the vital sign collapse on his screen, saw the window of opportunity open, saw a chance to let a patient die on her shift and blame it on her incompetence. And what she didn't know was that in the moment she saved Vance's life, she had also made him certain that she had to disappear. His phone was already in his hand by 0400 hours. He moved through the hospital with the precision of a man who understood institutional power the way a sniper understands wind speed and bullet drop. 15 doctors. He had their home numbers memorized, 15 cardiologists and critical care physicians scattered across Norfolk and Virginia Beach. He called them in sequence, feeding each one a different story. To Dr. Patel, he explained that the patient had a standing DNR order and a directive that heroic measures not be undertaken. To Dr. Chen, he He emphasized the resource allocation issues in the ICU and the bed shortage that would force difficult decisions. To Dr. Reeves, he simply said the case was complicated and that he was handling it. One by one, they declined the code. One by one, they accepted his version of events without question, because he was Sterling, because his word carried weight, because they'd never learned to ask the difficult questions. By 30 hours, Sterling was in the security office with the night shift supervisor, pulling footage from the camera that overlooked Vance's room. He watched Katie insert the needle. He watched her hands move with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, not once or twice, but dozens of times. He watched her save a man's life with nothing but a needle and nerve and knowledge that had no business existing in a hospital nurse. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. Because competence like that left traces. Competence like that raised questions. Competence like that made people wonder where she'd come from, what she'd done, what she was really capable of. He picked up the phone again. The chief of staff answered on the third ring, annoyed to be called before dawn. Sterling's voice was calm, almost apologetic. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Credentialing concerns. Liability exposure. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. By the time he hung up, a credentialing review had been initiated. By 0500 hours, an investigator had been assigned. By 0600 hours, a termination letter was being drafted, and Sterling was pulling Katie's file, searching for the places where her story didn't fit, the gaps where her past should have been but wasn't. She came in at 0700 hours for her shift, and the security guard was waiting with a cardboard box. His name was Marcus. He'd worked at Sacred Heart for 9 years and had never spoken to Katie except to nod in the hallway. Now his expression was carefully neutral, the practiced blankness of a man who'd done this job too many times before. The letter was printed on hospital letterhead, dated and signed. Unauthorized procedures. Credentialing irregularities. Terminated effective immediately. Pending investigation. Do not return to the premises. Katie took the box without speaking. Inside were her stethoscope, a coffee mug with an anchor emblem that she'd bought at a Navy exchange in Jacksonville, a framed photograph of a beach taken during a shore leave she'd tried to forget. Her hands were steady as she held it. Steady as they'd been at 0309 hours when she was saving a man's life. Steady as they would need to be now, because questions were being asked, and questions meant investigations, and investigations meant searches, and searches meant records, and her records didn't exist. The military had ordered her to disappear after the war crimes testimony. The Pentagon had erased her from the system, classified her entire service record, told her in a briefing room at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters that her survival depended on becoming someone else. No rank. No record. No proof. Just Katie Morrison, the quiet nurse who'd never done anything remarkable, never been anywhere significant, never existed in any meaningful way. She walked out through Sacred Heart's automatic doors into the grey light of Norfolk dawn. The sky was the color of concrete and regret. The rain that had threatened all night was finally falling, soft and relentless, pattering against her jacket like 1,000 small accusations. The parking lot smelled like asphalt and diesel fuel from the delivery trucks that had come during the night shift. She stood for a moment at the edge of the circular drive, holding the cardboard box that contained the last 9 months of her life, and understood that she'd just crossed into enemy territory with no backup, no extraction plan, and nowhere left to hide. The parking lot smelled like asphalt and diesel fuel from the delivery trucks that had come during the night shift. Katie stood at the edge of the circular drive, holding the cardboard box that contained the last 9 months of her life. Security had walked her to her car without speaking. The termination letter was already in her pocket, citing unauthorized procedures and credentialing irregularities. Everything Sterling had orchestrated. Everything carefully worded to make her look reckless instead of heroic. She didn't fight it. Couldn't fight it. The moment she pushed back, the moment she demanded a hearing or called a lawyer, someone would pull her medical records. Someone would notice the gaps in her employment history. Someone would ask questions about the 3 years she'd spent working under a false civilian SSN, living in a basement apartment in Arlington under a name that wasn't hers. Fighting meant exposure. Exposure meant the Pentagon would finally come for her, and this time there would be no extraction, no safe house, no second chance to disappear. So she'd taken the box. Thanked the guard. Walked to her 2008 Honda Civic with a bumper sticker that said nothing. Drove home in silence while her hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in the world. 3 weeks later, Katie sat in a VA hospital waiting room in Norfolk, surrounded by the faces she recognized. The 1,000-yard stares. The missing limbs. The invisible wounds that showed in the way a man flinched when a door slammed. She'd once treated these men and women in field hospitals under canvas tents while mortars landed 200 meters away. Now she was filling out intake paperwork in their company, a patient herself, with no rank to list and no service date she could prove. The form asked, branch of service. Her pen hovered over the blank space. What did she write when she officially never existed? The medical history section was worse. Surgical scars from a helicopter crash in Kandahar. Shrapnel wounds in her left shoulder from an IED outside Marja. A ruptured spleen she'd repaired herself with morphine and prayer in a compound that no longer appeared on any map. She left it all blank. The intake counselor would call it anxiety. Probably depression. Maybe PTSD. They'd be right about all three. The waiting room television played cable news. Something about a construction accident. A scaffolding collapse somewhere in the city. Multiple victims. She stared at the screen without processing it, just watching her pen hover over the form's mental health section. How did she describe 3 years of looking over her shoulder? How did she explain the way her heart rate spiked whenever someone mentioned the Pentagon? The emergency room doors burst open like an artillery round going off. Paramedics wheeled in a critical trauma on a gurney, the patient's chest wrapped in emergency dressings, blood seeping through the gauze despite the pressure bandaging. Chest crush injuries. Hemorrhaging. The EMS tech was calling out vitals in the practiced rhythm Katie recognized from 1,000 other calls. She glanced up reflexively with a medic's instinct, the way her nervous system was wired to respond to crisis. The patient's face stopped her heart. Fareed Omodi. The name came back first, then the context. Taliban commander. She'd treated him 3 years ago in a field hospital after a firefight, operating on him while his own men tried to kill her team outside the perimeter. She'd kept him alive with hands steady as surgical lasers, removing shrapnel from his abdomen, transfusing O-negative blood they didn't have enough of. He'd whispered prayers in Pashto while she worked. She'd whispered back in Dari, the words her grandmother had taught her before the Navy. After he stabilized, after she'd closed the final suture, he'd asked her name. She'd told him the truth. Senior Chief. Now he was a refugee construction worker with a scaffolding collapse, and his eyes were focused on her face with impossible recognition. His hand came up, pointing despite the pain, and his voice cut through the waiting room with the force of a command. Senior Chief. 20 heads turned. A nurse dropped a clipboard. The sound of it hitting linoleum echoed in the sudden silence like a gunshot. Fareed kept talking, bleeding and delirious, cycling between Pashto and broken English, loud enough for everyone in the waiting room to hear, "You saved me. Sangin. You saved me. You gave me back my life." Katie's face went white. Not from fear. From the impossible collision of two worlds that were never supposed to touch. Her hands gripped the intake form so hard the pen tore through the paper. Then footsteps. Running. Down the stairs from the second floor. Heavy footfalls that moved with purpose. Colonel Marcus Vance's grown daughter, Emily, came into the ER breathless, her father's personal effects clutched in trembling hands. She'd been sorting through his belongings upstairs in room 712, trying to understand the items he kept close. She'd heard the commotion. Heard the name Sangin spoken in the waiting room below. Heard a voice say Senior Chief. She held up the faded unit patch, the one she'd been staring at for weeks, trying to decipher the stitched names. At the top, embroidered in thread so old it had faded to the color of dried blood, SCPOKO Morrison. Emily looked at Katie. Looked at the patch. Whispered, "You're Morrison." The emergency room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum overhead. A Marine in a wheelchair moved closer. A nurse who'd been suturing a laceration in Bay 3 stopped moving, her needle frozen mid-stitch. The moment stretched like time running slow in combat, like everything had shifted on an axis and the world hadn't caught up yet. Emily's voice cracked, "You're the one. The medic he talks about. He's been talking about you for 3 years. Morrison. He said your name when he was unconscious." A man in navy dress blue stepped forward from the corridor. Command Master Chief Rodriguez, his uniform crisp as a knife edge, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, power waiting to be released. His voice came out hard as granite, Senior Chief Catherine Morrison. 2 silver stars. For bronze stars with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Cross. This woman pulled 13 men out of Sangin, including the Green Beret Colonel in room 712. The hospital administrator appeared in the ER entrance, his face draining of color like someone had opened a valve. An FBI liaison in a dark suit stepped forward, his badge visible, his voice carrying the weight of classified authority. Senior Chief Morrison was ordered into protective anonymity after providing testimony in a classified war crimes investigation. She witnessed a general order the execution of Afghan civilians. Her testimony secured a conviction. She's been living in deep cover for 3 years, her identity erased at the Pentagon level. The waiting room was completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The television kept playing, but nobody heard it anymore. Emily gripped Katie's hand, tears streaming down her face. "My father talks about you every single day. He has your name tattooed on his arm. He said you carried him 3 kilometers through Taliban fire. He said you wouldn't leave him behind." She looked at the Command Master Chief, her voice shaking. "This woman, she's the reason he survived Sangin. She's the reason he's alive." Rodriguez stepped closer to Katie, his bearing shifting from military formality to something that looked like respect. "We need to talk. All of us. Office. Now." He turned to the hospital administrator, and the steel in his voice could have cut glass. "I want to know why this officer was terminated from your cardiac unit. I want to know who made that decision. And I want to know what they were hiding." The administrator's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Behind him, in the hallway just visible through the ER doors, a figure appeared. Dr. Sterling. His face was ash-white, his hands trembling as he processed what he'd just heard. His mouth worked silently. The $12,000 Omega Seamaster on his wrist suddenly felt heavier. Everything he'd spent 3 weeks building, every phone call to board members he'd golfed with, every manufactured concern he'd planted in Katie's sparse references, every case he'd fed to the hospital investigator he'd cultivated for a decade, all of it had just collapsed. He was staring at a woman in scrubs sitting in a VA hospital waiting room, and she was a decorated military officer. She was federal. She had a Command Master Chief standing beside her. She was protected by the Pentagon itself. And she'd been right about his billing codes the whole time. The emergency room doors burst open at 08 for 7 hours, and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a construction worker crushed under steel scaffolding, his left leg wrapped in field dressings, his breathing shallow and panicked. Katie was 3 steps into the trauma bay when she saw his face. Fareed Omodi. The Taliban commander she'd treated after the firefight in Sangin, back when she was carrying a rifle instead of a stethoscope, back when his blood on her hands meant something different. His eyes found hers across the chaos of monitors and voices, and for a moment the entire emergency room froze in that recognition, the moment 2 people from opposite sides of a war found each other alive in a place neither had expected to be. Fareed's voice came out as a ragged gasp, his hand lifting toward her with a clarity that cut through the morphine and shock. "Senior Chief." He said it like a prayer. Like a name he'd carried through for years of exile and reconstruction work, waiting for this moment without knowing he was waiting. The entire ER team stopped. Nurses mid-motion. Residents turning. The words hung in the fluorescent air like a confession nobody had anticipated. Katie's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough, and she moved into position, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she began the secondary assessment without breaking stride. But the words were already out. Senior Chief. Not just a nurse. Not just a woman pushing a cart. Someone with rank. Someone with history. 2 floors above, in the cardiac recovery unit, Emily Vance heard the commotion from the stairwell. Her father had been awake for the first time in 5 days that morning, his eyes clearer, his confusion starting to shift toward something like awareness. She'd gone to get his personal effects from the secure storage, the clothes he'd arrived in, his wallet, the jacket he'd worn to the hospital the day of his collapse. Her hands trembled as she descended the stairs, drawn toward the noise like a compass needle finding north, and when she reached the trauma bay entrance, she froze. Katie Morrison stood over the construction worker, her entire body language transformed into something authoritative and lethal in its precision. Not the meek nurse from the cafeteria. Not the woman who'd been escorted out by security 3 weeks ago with a cardboard box of her belongings. This was someone else entirely. Emily clutched her father's jacket tighter and stepped back into the hallway, her fingers finding the inner lining where her father kept his most valuable possession, not money, not identification, but a faded unit patch. She pulled it out slowly, the fabric soft from decades of being carried close to skin, and read the stitched names of his SEAL team. Her eyes tracked across each one until they found it. SCPO Morrison. At the top. Not as a subordinate. As the ranking officer. The hospital administrator's office was quiet at 1100 hours when a man in dress blues walked through the door without knocking. Command Master Chief Rodriguez of Naval Special Warfare Command, his presence filling the room like a pressure change before a storm. Behind him came an FBI liaison with a briefcase and the kind of exhausted expression that comes from enforcing truths nobody wanted to hear. The administrator stood, confused, as Rodriguez placed a single photograph on the desk, Katie Morrison in full dress uniform, medals spanning her chest like a record of every crisis she'd survived. Senior Chief Catherine Morrison, Rodriguez said, his voice hard as granite. 2 silver stars. The administrator's confusion deepened. For bronze stars with Valor. Rodriguez's finger moved to the next ribbon. 2 purple hearts. A pause. The weight of the room shifted. Navy Cross. Rodriguez stepped back, letting the silence land. This woman pulled 13 men out of Sangin, including your patient upstairs. Colonel Marcus Vance. She saved his life in this hospital on March 14th using techniques that only someone with her training would recognize. And she was terminated for it. The FBI liaison opened the briefcase. Phone records. Call logs. A 15-call campaign documented with timestamps and voicemail transcriptions. Each call from Dr. Sterling. Each one a fabrication, a resource allocation excuse, a DNR status lie designed to ensure no other physician would respond to the cardiac code. The administrator's face went pale. The liaison pulled out a second file. Senior Chief Morrison testified in a classified hearing 6 years ago. A war crimes case. Her testimony resulted in the conviction of a general commanding officer. She was placed in deep cover by Pentagon order. Essentially erased. No military record. No service documentation. No proof of her own existence. He looked directly at the administrator. And in the time she's been here, Dr. Sterling has been operating a billing fraud scheme that we've been tracking for 18 months. She documented discrepancies. 23 of them. She didn't know what she was looking at. But she was right about all of them. By 1500 hours, the same security guard who'd walked Katie out 3 weeks earlier stood at Dr. Sterling's office with an identical cardboard box in his hands. His expression was professionally neutral, the kind of neutral that comes from having seen this exact scene play out before. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. His hands shook as he pulled his diplomas from the wall, the expensive frames suddenly looking cheap in the harsh light. The guard set the box on the desk without speaking. When Sterling finally looked up, the guard's voice was quiet and final. "I believe you know the way out, sir." The words were barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of a courtroom judgment. Sterling's medical license was already flagged for investigation. The board members he'd golfed with for years had issued statements distancing themselves. His attorney had stopped answering calls at 1,430 hours. The hospital's outside counsel had filed a report with the state medical board by 1445 hours. His keycard stopped functioning at 1,600 hours. His parking space was reassigned by 1630 hours. And by the time the sun set over Norfolk, Dr. Sterling sat alone in his luxury car in an empty parking lot, staring at a termination letter, his phone ringing with calls from attorneys he suddenly couldn't afford. Katie walked past Sacred Heart's main entrance at 1900 hours, heading toward the staff entrance for the night shift. Her name was already on the wall in the lobby under Distinguished Staff: Catherine Morrison, SCPO, retired, Director of Emergency Medicine. It had taken exactly 8 hours from the moment Farid Omodi gasped her rank until the hospital had offered her the position. Not as an apology. As a recognition. As a restoration of what should never have been taken. The cardiac care unit buzzed with the normal rhythm of evening shifts, monitors beeping, nurses charting, the organized chaos of people who understood that some lives hung on moments and details. Colonel Marcus Vance was awake in his recovery room, his memory returning in fragments, each day bringing him closer to the face that had haunted his dreams for 5 days. Emily had told him everything. About the tattoo. About the unit patch. About the woman who'd climbed out of the shadows to save him twice, once in a compound in Sangin, and again in his darkest hour. They had coffee scheduled for Wednesday morning. Every Wednesday morning. He was remembering more each week. The compound. The smoke. Her voice telling him to stay awake. By next Wednesday, he'd probably remember all of it. The 15 doctors who'd refused the code blue received disciplinary notices over the following month. 12 faced reviews. 3 lost hospital privileges entirely. All of them received Katie's name and her service record. All of them knew exactly what they'd failed to do, and why they'd failed. Sterling's insurance table at the strip mall folded after 6 weeks. He'd sold 3 policies. Made approximately $400. Then he stopped showing up. Katie walked past that location twice without slowing down. The past was the past, and some people were meant to be forgotten the way they'd tried to make her forgotten. Farid Omodi recovered from his scaffolding injuries over the next 4 months and took a job with Sacred Heart's construction company, building the new emergency medicine wing. He and Katie never spoke beyond professional acknowledgement, but something had shifted in the space between them, the complicated respect of 2 people who'd seen each other at their worst and survived it. At the ICU nurses' station where the chaos had started 6 weeks earlier, Katie stood training a new hire on post-operative cardiac assessment when the resident asked the question she'd anticipated: "How do you stay so calm under this kind of pressure?" Katie smiled, thinking of Sangin, thinking of Sterling's face, thinking of the weight of carrying a military rank in silence for so long. "I've seen worse than a bad shift," she said quietly. And that was enough. That was all that needed to be said. If you made it this far, you already know there's more stories like this one, stories of people you've underestimated, people who've survived things that would break anyone else, people whose real strength lives in quiet moments until the moment comes when they can't stay silent anymore. Subscribe, because we're telling these stories every single week. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been wrong about someone? Have you ever judged someone and found out they were stronger than you ever knew? Your story might be the one we tell next.